What we're now going to look at is 3 concept areas that young people and their parents or carers may find problematic, either hard to discuss, or they know that these things are happening for their young person and they don't quite know how to address it. So what we're going to look at is consent, sexting, and pornography. So first of all, we'll start with consent. Now, unfortunately, consent, it should be black or white, because consent is yes or no. Young people are giving their consent to multiple things on a daily basis, okay? We talk to young people the fact that every time they sign a piece of paper, or the parents or carers sign a piece of paper, they're signing to give somebody permission on their behalf to do something or be involved in something. Unfortunately, when it comes to sexual consent, we don't have the piece of paper that gets handed over and said, can you just sign here to say that you're agreeing to have sex with me? Now, some of the basics, what is sexual consent? It's saying yes or indeed no to sexual acts or behaviours. Across Australia now, the legal age of consent for sex is 16. That's 16 for males and females, regardless of the gender identity of their partner. Unfortunately, consent can become grey and not be as black and white or yes and no because of things like drug and alcohol use. So our key message is to be honest with young people. We're not the fun police, but we're the safety supporters. We know that young people are likely to engage in sexual acts or sexual behaviours under the influence of drugs or alcohol. We just like to remind them about the legalities around that. And the law does state that under no amount of drug or alcohol can a young person consent to sex. That is, that drugs and alcohol all impact on us differently. Okay, so no drugs or alcohol. If young people are planning on going out to a party, they plan on drinking or taking recreational drugs, think about harm minimisation approaches for those behaviours, but also take sex out of the equation, because it can become quite difficult trying to get clear on whether or not consent was given. In terms of having a teachable moment, you can see on the screen there, it's an acronym which spells out FRIES. So talking about a teachable moment, next time you're at Hungry Jack's, Burger King, KFC, McDonald's, I better give them all a shout out so that we're not seen to be promoting one over the other. Next time you're sitting down and sharing some fries, or as we like to say in Australia, chips with young people, take it as a teachable moment. So FRIES, when it comes to consent, stands for freely given. So that is that consent is freely given. We shouldn't feel forced, pressured or coerced into giving that consent. We're agreeing to those behaviours because we want to do them. That consent is always reversible. So for example, I might consent to sex in the beginning, things start to get a little bit hot and heavy, the kissing and the touching turns to other things, and all of a sudden my gut instinct kicks in and says, I actually don't feel comfortable with this. I can reverse or take that consent back at any time, and my decision needs to be respected by that partner. Consent should always be informed. So the same as we always, you tick here to say you've read the terms and conditions, you know what it is that you're signing up for. The same too happens with consent. Also, just because, for example, a young person might agree to having oral sex doesn't mean that they're going to move on to agree to having anal or vaginal sex. So really checking in with what it is exactly they're giving consent for. Consent should be enthusiastic. It's not just a young person sitting in a corner in a pose going, yes, I want to have sex with you. It needs to be enthusiastic. Like, yes, there is nothing I can think of that I'd rather be doing right now than becoming sexually active with you. I'm informed, I know what it is that I want, and I'm being enthusiastic about the consent that I'm giving. And as I mentioned, specific. So I give consent specifically to oral sex, but I don't want to have anal sex, as an example. For a long time, the consent message has been no means no, and indeed it does. If a young person was in a sexual situation and they were to say no or stop, we would expect that their partner would respect their wishes and to do that. If that behaviour continued, it would be what we would call unwanted sexual contact, sexual assault, or rape. For a long time, we've said no means no, but we're starting to move towards a yes is yes, because there are ways that a young person can mean no without actually saying the word no. And that really comes down to body language. So if somebody is curled in a corner, not responding to sexual touch, this is their body language saying no. They haven't actually said no, but they're very much giving off signs of no. So what does a yes is yes look like? We're asking young people to check in with their partners. What questions can they ask that could get yes answers to indicate that they're getting consent and that their partner is happy or feels comfortable with what's happening. So questions like, would you like to have sex with me? Do you feel comfortable? Do you feel safe? Is it okay if we use condoms as protection? If they're checking in and getting yes responses, they can assume that they're getting consent and that their partner feels okay, as long as it meets the criteria of consent there with fries, that it's enthusiastic, etc. Some of the young people we've been working with have said that's a really awkward conversation to have, and we agree with them. But the more often they're having these conversations, the more often they're asking these questions to their partners, the more familiar they become with it. It becomes a bit like a script. They would say it in any situation because it just becomes the norm. What is a difficult conversation for a young person is if they are accused of unwanted sexual contact or sexual assault. It's a difficult conversation for them to have in front of a judge or magistrate. So whilst these conversations can be difficult, they're incredibly important, and we want young people to appreciate and respect consent, not just for themselves, but also for their partners. So I guess some of those take-home messages include things like it can be tricky to navigate, but it's extremely important that we're talking to our young people about this. Think about role modelling consent, because this is what young people are missing through the TV shows and the movies, etc., that I spoke about before. It's not very often that we see a movie or a TV show where there's a sex scene and consent has been discussed, let alone protection and condom use. So role model that behaviour within your everyday life. When they have given consent to other situations, point that out to them. Hey, you just gave consent to that. That's what consent looks like. That's what consent is all about. And that final take-home message, as I mentioned before, that if they're going to be going to a party and drugs and alcohol are involved, think about those harm minimisation techniques and to just take sex out of the equation. The second topic that we want to talk about that parents and carers are often concerned about when it comes to young people is sexting. Sexting is the sending or receiving of a sexually explicit image or message using an electronic device, so usually a mobile phone. And I want you to think about what makes this problematic for young people, because it's not just young people who are doing this behaviour. There are lots of adults out there who are sexting as well. So why do we become concerned about young people, and why do we raise this as an issue with them and want to provide further information and education? Jen will pop a link into the chat box for the Office of the E-Safety Commission. These guys are great for parents and carers. There's lots of resources, information and fact sheets on their webpage, not just around sexting, but also on dating apps and apps that young people commonly download, as well as gaming. A great place to go to be able to get your head around that online world, because as I mentioned before, it's not wrong, it's just different. The things that young people are exposed to today might be very different to our generation when we were growing up and going through this development and areas of exploration and experimentation. So what's the big deal if young people are doing it and older people are doing it as well? The big deal for young people is that it is considered possession of child pornography if they have those explicit images of people under the age of 18 years. So I just want to read this out so that I can give you the accurate information around this, and that you can then pass this on to young people, and this information can be found on the E-Safety Commission. So being in possession of sexually explicit photographs or nudes of someone under the age of 18 is considered child pornography and can have serious consequences if found guilty. Asking for, taking, sending, viewing or sharing these images can all be considered chargeable offences. So even, for example, if the young person has taken that photo of themselves and they're under the age of 18, that can be considered the making of child pornography, and that is a chargeable offence as well. Problematic for young people because quite often these images are taken in good faith. They may have a partner that they're in a relationship with and the partner has requested a nude. They take it in good faith and they send it. What often happens though is that young people's relationships don't last forever, and when those relationships end, somebody usually has their nose out of joint. There's a bit of disappointment and they want to get back at that person. The best and easiest, quickest, fastest way for them to get back to that person is often to share that nude image with their peer group. We've heard horrific stories of young people where they've had to leave the school because there wasn't one person in their peer group that hadn't seen their naked image. So whilst taking that initial image can actually be really boosting for somebody's self-esteem, and we know how important that is because of the conversations that we had a little earlier, the flip side of that is that it can also be extremely damaging to their self-esteem once those images are released and they have to deal with the backlash that comes from that. Having that damaged self-esteem obviously can also lead to both short-term immediate consequences, but longer-term ones as well, such as having to leave that school and restart and make new peer groups. So what are some of the key take-home messages that can provide to young people? As I said, I think, you know, one of my new key mottos is we're not the fun police, but we're safety supporters. If our young people are going to be engaging in these acts and behaviours, what can we do as adults to guide them in a way that is going to minimise the harm associated with that? So if they're going to take the image without any distinguishing features. So make sure there's no tattoos or birthmarks in the photo, and don't include your face, okay? Explain the legalities to young people. So explain that if they are caught in possession of those nudes of people under the age of 18, that they could be charged with possession of child pornography, and that they may be charged with it if they're taking those images as well. And to really think about that self-esteem aspect. So whilst it might be uplifting for self-esteem to take the image, the impact on that image being released can have quite a negative impact. Pornography. So as parents and carers, this is one that probably rocks the boat a little bit, and we do get some parents and carers coming to us really concerned about the young people in their lives and the viewing of pornography. Now, what I will say is that pornography is so easily accessible for this generation. Most young people have smartphones that they can access pornography very quickly, very cheaply, and very readily. Young people from about the age of 12 are accessing this pornography online. Some of them are intentionally accessing it, others are coming across it accidentally. So we do know that things like YouTube love to have cute little draw cards to get young people in. They might start to watch something innocently, and then all of a sudden it turns to pornography, which is quite often what we would consider hardcore. So some people are also using it as an educational tool. They're getting some of their information and knowledge of sexual experiences from porn, and I'll talk to that in a moment because that's what we are concerned about. What we really want young people to know and appreciate is that there is a very big difference between what they see in porn versus experiences in real life. Jen will pop up a fantastic clip from YouTube into that chat box. It's called Real Sex versus Porn Sex, and it uses food to explain the difference. It's very funny, but very educational. I recommend showing that to your young people as a way to teach and explain the difference. So porn sex is not real sex. Quite often in porn, they're not discussing consent, they're not using protection. And in fact, porn can be an example of sexual acts that most people may not feel comfortable with. The expectations of young people around sexual acts and what people will do should not come from porn. And in fact, some porn actually represents what we would consider forceful sex, which is not what we want young people to be engaging in or expecting. Things are not as they seem in porn. So for example, anatomical parts are not one of a kind. Vaginas and penises all look different, whereas on porn they're kind of reflected as one in the same. So that can impact on a young person's self-esteem, particularly young women. We have a lot of young people who are worried about the size of their labia, the outer parts of their vagina, because of what they've seen in porn movies or magazines. Not everybody removes their pubic hair as they do in porn. Not everybody wants to partake in all types of adventurous sexual behaviours or have same-sex couplings or have group sex. All of these things which can be demonstrated to young people in porn, but not necessarily partake over into reality. Should you be concerned if your young person is watching porn? There's no right answer. There's a yes and a no. So if young people are accessing porn, what we would consider soft porn, fairly straight lines, male, female, you know, somewhat like themed porn, then potentially it can be an educational tool, as long as you're providing those messages that what they see in porn is not exactly translatable to real life. If a young person is accessing harder porn and things that you may not typically see, so quite violent sexual porn, group sex, the kinds of things that you wouldn't typically expect within society and relationships, that's when there may be a bigger problem. And unfortunately, it is possible for a young person to become addicted to watching pornography. So what I would say around that, just in terms of the take-home messages, is that viewing pornography could be seen again as a rite of passage for young people. It's a part of that experimentation, how they're going about learning. It's easily accessible. They may even be watching it with mates and exposed to it without having wanted to be exposed to it. As long as we can get across the message that what they're seeing in porn isn't real, that's not what's happening in real life, and for them not to have expectations about their own sexual experiences purely based on what it is that they've seen in porn.